Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to talk about secrets of political survivors, based very loosely on my book, but I want to range much more widely than simply a memoir about a British politician, in this case me, who spent 36 years in the House of Commons. And may I say at the end of this, I'd be very happy to take questions for as long as we have in this session. I want to begin with a quotation very familiar to all current and aspiring British politicians. And it goes like this: all political lives end in failure unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. And this was an observation made in 1977 by the very talented but rather demagogic right-wing British politician Enoch Powell, who himself had a very dismal view of his fellow men and women and a melancholic view of himself. As a universal law of politics, I don't think that it's correct. There are plenty of political leaders the world over who lead perfectly contented lives and who die peacefully in their beds to be celebrated and mourned by their nation and beyond. There are nonetheless some truths in what Enoch Powell said, and certainly many lessons from history and my own experience in British politics of the hazards and pitfalls of exercising power in a democracy. The first and rather brutal truth is that if, in Enoch Powell's ironic words, your life is cut off at a midstream, at a happy juncture, you are more likely to be remembered as a national hero and given the status of a demigod than if you live to a ripe old age. The best example I can give of this is that of United States President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's election in November 1960 heralded a great new modern era. He was the first United States president to have been born in the 20th century, the youngest to be elected to that office, the first and indeed the only Roman Catholic ever to be elected, and telegenic with a very glamorous wife. I'm old enough to remember, I was 14 at the time, the huge excitement there was around the world about Kennedy's election and the way in which it signaled the dawning of a new age. And within a few months it coincided with that revolution in popular music, which signifies the era in which people like me were young. And like everyone of my generation, I can still remember exactly where I was when news of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas, came through on the 22nd of November, 1963. It was a shocking, traumatic moment. So Kennedy is rightly memorialized today for what he achieved, not least the nuclear test ban treaty, something very close to the heart of your president here, and the peaceful resolution of the truly frightening Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as laying the foundations for civil rights laws in the United States. But had Kennedy lived to see 2 terms as president, I suspect that history's verdict on him would have been much tougher. For one truth of political life in a democracy is that charismatic leaders securing office for the first time often find themselves invested with almost superhuman powers and expectations, only for the public to find themselves later to be disappointed or to feel betrayed, not just because of some human failings by the leader concerned, but more because the dreams which the voters have had for the new leader have only been that, dreams, which could never be fulfilled. And I'll return to that point later in this lecture. There are, however, some notable exceptions to Enoch Powell's rule that all political lives end in failure, where a political figure has been able unexpectedly to pull success from a career which otherwise seemed destined for obscurity. These are the leaders on whom the gods have been very kind at the right time. Very simply, they have been lucky. And you'll all know that when Napoleon was asked about the qualities that he most needed in his generals, he replied that the qualities that he most needed in his generals was that they were lucky generals. In his brilliant book, Thinking Fast and Slow, the Nobel laureate behavioral psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, discusses the key factors which lead to success. Research shows, he says, that some success is down to talent and quite a lot of luck. Great success is down to considerable talent and to a huge amount of luck. And one of the things that I saw throughout my political career is that there were people who started with me 40 years ago, who came into the Commons 30 years ago, who were just as talented as those of us who managed to attain high office, but they weren't in the right place at the right time. They were unlucky, we were lucky, so we succeeded and they did not. The best example of a lucky politician, in my view, is Winston Churchill, Britain's greatest ever war leader. Though in retrospect, it may appear that Churchill's destiny was inevitably to lead Britain through its time of mortal danger and on to victory against the Nazis, that was not remotely how it appeared to Churchill himself or to his contemporaries at the time. Churchill's political career, up to the beginning of the Second World War, could at best be described as patchy and second-rate. As Home Secretary in the 1906 Liberal government, he was remembered as an authoritarian who used unnecessary force to suppress strikes by coal miners and by others. As the Navy Minister, First Lord of the Admiralty, in the First World War, he was directly responsible for the greatest single defeat for Britain of that war, the Gallipoli campaign on the Dardanelles on the western Turkish coast. Churchill's botched strategy led to the death of at least 50,000 Allied soldiers and other service personnel, and though the Ottoman Empire, by most estimates, suffered even greater casualties, they did secure a famous victory which prolonged the war. Churchill was forced out of office, but he had a survivor's instinct and wisely accepted the advice of his confidant, William Beaverbrook, a newspaper magnate, that it would only be by resuming active service as an army officer and fighting at the front in France that he would have any chance of redeeming himself in the eyes of the public and his peers. He did this, and Churchill gradually became rehabilitated, but he changed party. Some countries you can change party and it's okay. In the United Kingdom, changing party always leads to a heavy level of suspicion. And he moved from being the Liberals to the Conservatives in the early 1920s. And that made him distrusted by people of all parties. As finance minister in the 1920s, Chancellor of the Exchequer, he made a catastrophic decision of returning the pound sterling to the gold standard of pre-war parities. And that led to deflation, to a huge loss of competitiveness for British manufacturers, to mounting unemployment, and because of the mounting unemployment, to Britain's first and only general strike. Churchill later commented that he considered that this decision of his to return Britain to the gold standard, in other words, to increase the value of the pound sterling against other currencies, was the single greatest mistake of his political life. When the Conservative government, of which Churchill was a member, ended in 1929, Churchill spent the whole of the next decade in the wilderness, out of office, even though the Conservatives were the dominant party continuously from 1931 until the end of that decade. Churchill objected to almost any attempt to provide a degree of self-government to India and spoke in near racist terms of Indian leaders. He dismissed the greatest of the Indian leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, as, quotes, a half-naked fakir. He got tied up with all sorts of wealthy people whose financial and ethical standards were questionable, so much so that in today's climate in the United Kingdom, and indeed in almost any other country in the Western democratic world with its increasing emphasis on transparency, Churchill would almost certainly have fallen foul of the regulators and could have been dismissed from holding office ever again. Churchill's record of his time in the wilderness in the 1930s is remembered today for his prescient warnings that Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler posed an existential threat to Britain and to the whole of the civilized world. And he made those warnings, and he was quite right. But at the time, few people were listening to Churchill because he'd been so discredited in the past. The House of Commons, when he made these speeches, was typically empty when he spoke, and the spirit of the time was to avoid a second war at almost any cost, including an accommodation with Hitler, and Churchill was heavily criticized as a warmonger who had learnt little from his disasters of the First World War. But cometh the hour, cometh the man. Early British disasters at the beginning of the Second World War led to the resignation of the Conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and an understanding by the leaders of all the parties, including my own, the Labour Party, that the only man who had all the talents to lead Britain from this moment of profound danger was Churchill. And so it turned out. But Churchill's subsequent career, once the war was over, also illustrates a wider truth about survival in democratic politics and gives some credence to Enoch Powell's dismal observation that all political lives end in failure. And this is that however brilliant you may have been, you have a shelf life. For a tiny handful of politicians, very successful leaders, that shelf life is their natural life. For most of the rest of us mere mortals, it's less than your natural life. And the electorate and your own colleagues in your own party can and will be ruthless and completely without sentiment when they think that it's time for you to leave office. And I give three examples of this. The first concerns Winston Churchill himself. Churchill was an outstanding war leader. There was little doubt in the minds of most of the British electorate and of Britain's servicemen and women that without him, Britain might well have suffered ignominious defeat rather than victory in the Second War. As soon as the war was over, Churchill called a general election, as he was obliged to do, as there had not been an election for 10 years because of the war. Churchill believed that his war record would be enough to propel him to victory, to lead the peace. So did leaders of the opposition parties, my own party, Labour. But the electorate had quite different ideas. Their view was that Churchill's qualification as a war leader did not make him qualified as a prime minister when the agenda was one of reconstruction after the war. The electorate wanted social and economic change, and they correctly believed that Churchill, because he was very conservative and reactionary, could not deliver this. Churchill ran a disastrous and complacent campaign, in the course of which, in a notorious election broadcast, he accused the Labour Party of planning to introduce a Gestapo if we were elected. We were elected by a huge landslide. And Churchill felt very hurt that he'd just been pushed out of office and the electorate was showing no gratitude to him. The electorate did redeem themselves a little 4 years later when they did elect Churchill as a Prime Minister in 1951, and he served for 4 years until he retired voluntarily as leader in 1955. But I just make my point again that Churchill, he was the right man at the right time, and he was the luckiest politician in Britain of the 20th century. Now, my second example I wanted to give is that of Margaret Thatcher. And this is an example of how, however great you may be, certainly in British politics, there'll come a moment where the electorate say, thank you very much, goodbye. Margaret Thatcher was elected by a good majority in 1979, and she so dominated politics in the 1980s that she won 2 further elections in 1983 and 1987 by even bigger margins. But as she became more powerful, and as she crafted a cabinet in her own image, so paradoxically did she become more vulnerable as well. There were not enough people around her who were ready to speak truth to power. And in any event, she became more and more reluctant to listen to those who did not agree with her. And as a result of this, she began to make mistakes. I got elected as a very young member of Parliament the same day that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. So I remember watching this from the opposition benches inside the British House of Commons. The system of local taxation we had was unpopular. There was great talk of reform, but sometimes reforms make things worse rather than better. And a reform she introduced made things much worse, especially for her party, because the reform of local taxation she introduced was called a poll tax, so it's basically just a tax per head without reference to people's income. And it led to a lot of civil disobedience, to riots, to very bad municipal election results, and it was coupled with an increasing argument inside her own party about whether Britain should support the European Union. That argument continues to this day. She was forced to resign at the end of November 1990, and she remained very bitter indeed about what she saw as the ingratitude of her own party and the electorate for her removal from office. My third example of how you can be very popular and then your shelf life finishes is that of Tony Blair, the man whom I served in his cabinet for 10 years when he was our Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007. Like Margaret Thatcher with the Conservative Party, Tony Blair dominated his party, the Labour Party, and the government. After 18 years in opposition and 4 electoral defeats, Tony led Labour to its greatest ever victory. And that was in 1997. He repeated that again in 2001. And even after the Iraq War, Tony Blair remained popular and won a 3rd election in 2005 with a reduced but still good working majority in the House of Commons. But particularly from mid-2006, his approach, especially on foreign policy towards the Middle East, was less and less popular within his own party and within the country. His one-time ally, the finance minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, was getting increasingly impatient that it was his turn to become Prime Minister. And Gordon claimed that he'd had a deal, a pact with Mr. Blair going back to the time when Mr. Blair became the leader of the Labour Party in 1994, that after 10 years or so, that Tony would hand over to him. So the result of all this was that there was a crisis in the leadership in early September 2006, and Mr. Blair announced that he would leave office the following summer, which he duly did at the end of June 2007. Though Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair left their office as Prime Minister not at the time of their own choosing, and Winston Churchill was deeply bruised by his defeat in 1945, each of them had, of course, achieved the highest political office in our land and made a success of it. But not everyone can be a Prime Minister. So what are the lessons for political survival do I draw more generally from my experience as a British Member of Parliament for 36 years, and indeed as one of the only 3 Labour cabinet ministers who were to stay in cabinet throughout the 13 years of the 1997 to 2010 Labour governments. I may just say that because this is a quite important issue these days within the United Kingdom, that there were 3 of us who survived the 13 years between 1997 and 2010 in the British cabinet. But 2 of those were Scotsmen, and I was the only Englishman to do so. I'm very proud of that. The first lesson that I offer you is that there is no point going into politics in a vibrant democracy like that of the United Kingdom unless you have a framework of beliefs, a strong work ethic, and great personal resilience. British politics, I'm pleased to say, is clean, as is overwhelmingly British public and business life. British members of Parliament are reasonably paid. They're paid £84,000 sterling a year, but no one comes into British politics for the money. And talented politicians in Britain could easily earn far more in other occupations. All outside earnings and expenses have to be declared. There's intense scrutiny of one's personal and family life. So you have to have a faith, a framework of beliefs to keep you going. How often on a wet Friday evening, with rain dripping down my neck as I knocked on door after door seeking votes, have I thought, why am I doing this? And unless you can answer because you have a philosophy and a program, it's a good idea to give up and to find an easier job. One of the characteristics of a parliamentary system is that, and I'll come on to this in a moment, is that your ministers are drawn from the elected parliamentarians. Whereas in other systems, the United States, here, and many others, you have a presidential system. Sorry, did you want to? Okay. You have a presidential system where it's the president appoints ministers from an executive. So this difference came home to me one Friday evening when I was in my constituency in Blackburn, knocking on doors seeking votes, and Igor Ivanov, who was the Russian foreign minister at the time, wanted to talk to me on the telephone about the drafting of the critical resolution on Iraq, which became Resolution 1441. So Igor was in his grand office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. I was knocking on the doors of small houses in this mill town of mine in Blackburn and asking for votes for a municipal election. And one of the police officers with me came to me and said, "You've got to go back into your car, boss, to take a telephone call from Mr. Ivanov." So I went back into the car, and Igor, who was and is a good friend and spoke very good English, he started going on to me about the very detailed text of this resolution. And I said to him, "Hang on, Igor, I don't have the papers in front of me." "Where are you?" he says. I said, "Look, I'm not in the ministry. I'm on a street in an industrial town, which is my constituency." So he said, "What are you doing there?" I said, "Igor, I'm going from door to door asking for votes." And there was a very long pause. And he said, "Jack, in my country, I do not have that problem." But it showed the big difference. Because there were elected politicians in Russia, but he wasn't one of them. Whereas I had to combine these two jobs. Anyway. So as I said, because you have these, you have to keep these balls in the air, but it's very tiring if you're an elected politician. I mean, it is if you're not an elected politician. If you are an elected politician, it's really tiring. You need to have a faith to keep you going. There's also, I'd say, this issue of intrusion into your private and family life. It's actually, in most respects, got a lot better in the United Kingdom. And these days, there is much less intrusion into politicians' children than there was, or into a politician's personal circumstances, unless a politician says, "Look at me, I've always been married to the same woman, I've never had any outside liaisons, and here are my lovely children." If you do that, and it turns out not to be true, then the press will almost kill you. But it's very different from America, where I think horribly American politicians feel obliged to parade even their infant children, as if the fact that they've got 3 children with good teeth and good hair is an illustration of their qualifications for high political office. It's obviously not. The other good thing that's happened, certainly in the United Kingdom, is that now whether people are gay or lesbian is irrelevant and scarcely reported, and that's been a dramatic change, and I'm proud to say I played a major part in changing the law to treat gay people on an equal terms with those who are straight. We've also got a lot more women into the House of Commons now. When I joined the House of Commons in 1979, there were just 3% of the House of Commons were women. So there were 19 women out of 650. Today, it's almost 30%, 30, and in my party, it's 43%. The other good thing is that there is now better representation of our Black and Asian population. About 11% of the population in the UK are Black or Asian. When I joined the House of Commons, there were no Black or Asian members of Parliament. There are now 41, and the numbers are rising. But just to come back to this issue of survival, as I said a moment ago, whilst there is less intrusion into people's family life, there is much, actually more intrusion into your financial circumstances. There was a great scandal about MPs' expenses 7 years ago. A number of British MPs were jailed for fiddling with their expenses. The system has been tightened up very considerably. And now all MPs' expenses, all MPs' expenses have to be published. Every detail of any outside earnings has to be made public as well. And the second rule of survival, the first rule of survival in politics is you need to believe in something, otherwise forget it. Second is, if you want to stay in politics, you need to be clean. The third lesson is a very simple one, that if you want to survive in British politics, or politics anywhere, you have to work very hard. It's very demanding. And there was a time when the newspapers were deferential, and there was almost a conspiracy between the political reporters and members of Parliament not to expose those MPs who were lazy, for example. And I remember there was a satirical television program in the early 60s, part of this kind of social revolution of the early 1960s. which brought out that there were 12 members of Parliament who in the previous 4 years had never said a single thing in the House of Commons. They were called the 12 silent men. You can't be silent for a week in the British House of Commons these days because people are monitoring what you're doing. My fourth lesson for survival, if you become a minister, is to show that you are a good decision maker. As I've explained, in a parliamentary system, ministers are drawn from the elected representatives. There are a few who are not, but overwhelmingly they are. The qualifications and the qualities you need to become an elected politician are not necessarily the same as those you need to be a good decision maker of executive decisions as a minister. And it was quite surprising to me, going from opposition into government, to see quite a number of my colleagues, including some very senior colleagues, who were almost trapped in the headlights, paralyzed into inaction when they were presented with some really difficult decisions where none of the choices available were really good choices, but they were the only choices. Because that's the nature of life. There are often no perfect decisions to make. And in the British system, certainly, things are made really much more, even more focused for the individual minister, because by law, it's the individual minister, the Secretary of State, who is responsible for decisions rather than some abstract notion of the government. So you quickly are sorted out between those who can't get on top of the decisions and those, and happily it turned out that I could do this, who are able to work through the mountain of papers, of dossier that you had, to look at them once, to come to a decision, and then to move on. And to accept, which you have to, that most decisions you may get right, some you will get wrong. You're bound to get decisions wrong, however long you think about a thing. And if you get them wrong, you need to change the decision if you've got the opportunity to change the decision, and then to move on. Just to come towards the end of this, my sixth lesson for survival is that you need a sense of humor, above all an ability to laugh at yourself. If you haven't got an ability to laugh at yourself, then you will not survive in politics. And you need to be able to laugh with others. Without that, you're done for. My seventh lesson is the need for courtesy, especially with your opponents. The British House of Commons is famous for appearing to be a bear garden where people shout at each other. And that's particularly true for Prime Minister's Questions, which is the half an hour each week, which is most broadcast around the world. But there are also courtesies required. And one of the things I learned from a British Conservative politician, John Major, who became Prime Minister, was that he was immensely courteous and careful, especially with his opponents on our side. Of course, if you said something stupid to John Major, he would slap you down, but he did it carefully. And when he unexpectedly became leader of the Conservative Party after Margaret Thatcher was pushed out. And one of the reasons for this was he'd been courteous with the Labour Party, and so when our Conservative friends asked who we thought was good on their side, we would say John Major, because he was nice to us, and we appreciated that. And you never lose by being courteous. And connected with courtesy, there's the escalator principle. Escalators not only go up, they also come down. And you always need to remember that whilst when the escalator's going up, you'll see other people on the way down. One day, it could be you on the way down, and your competitors on the way up. And in my book, the Bible, there is a famous proverb that pride cometh before a fall, and haughty spirit before damnation. So one always needs to bear that in mind and not to be arrogant. And my last lesson picks up an observation I made at the beginning of this lecture about how the public tire of political leaders because they think their dreams are unfulfilled. In the life of any leader or senior politician, there is likely to come a time where the public want to see a different face. It doesn't mean that you failed, though it may feel like that at the time. It's not that all political lives end in failure, but it is the case that all political lives finish, and usually sooner than the individual would wish. But that's just how it is. In a very British phrase, politics is a rough old trade. It is, but it's also, I have to say, hugely satisfying and on good days, a lot of fun. For me, it was a huge privilege to serve in the British House of Commons all those years, and I felt incredibly lucky that I was able to fulfill a childhood dream of getting into the British House of Commons and staying there for such a long time. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Yes, madam. I think it's probably easy so that other people can hear you.
Hello? Yeah. Do you mind if I read it? Because I'm quite nervous. So first of all, it's a great pleasure to meet you. You said that when you were in the office, when you just came into the parliament, Margaret Thatcher just came into the office. So yeah. When you were in the office, I studied politics in Oxford. So my question is, in the light of the current situation in the Middle East and speaking about the mistakes of the political life, have you changed your opinion on the Iraq war?
Okay, right. Did everybody hear that question? It's whether, given what's happened in the Middle East, have I changed my opinion on the Iraq war? We're awaiting the results of a huge inquiry into the Iraq war, chaired by a man called Sir John Chilcot. I don't want to, if you excuse me, preempt what he and his colleagues have to say, not least about me. However, if you're asking me whether, had I known at the time what we later learned, which was that Saddam Hussein did not have the holdings of chemical and biological weapons that we thought he had, if we'd known that at the time we made the decision, would we have made the same decision? My answer is no, we wouldn't. Everybody thought there were large holdings of chemical and biological weapons in Iraq, and that included people like Igor Ivanov and my French and German counterparts. The argument with France and Germany and Russia and China was not about whether Saddam posed a threat, it was about how you dealt with that threat. Everybody thought that was the case. If what later emerged was that that none of this material could be found and seemed to have been disposed of. So if we'd known that later, I certainly would never have supported a decision to go to war. The other thing I'm very happy to say, or though much less happy about the circumstance, is that some serious mistakes were made after the invasion, and above all, a terrible mistake made by the United States senior administrator, Paul Bremer, in Iraq, to de-Ba'athify the whole of the Iraqi security forces and government. We discussed what to do about the Ba'ath Party in advance with the Americans. And when we discussed it, they were very clear that they'd follow a similar approach to the approach which the British and the Americans followed in Germany after the war, where you cut the head off the Nazi Party, but you accepted that plenty of people were ordinary people, members of the Nazi Party, because they had no option. And you would ask them to be loyal to you, but you carry on employing them and ensuring they were paid. That was the expectation. Paul Bremer decided, without consultation with us, and with very little consultation in the American system, to say that if you were connected with the Ba'ath Party, you would lose your job. And getting on for 2 million people lost their jobs. A lot of these people were army personnel who still had their weapons. They then had no money. And that contributed to the insurgency later. So that's an answer. Okay. Are there other questions, please? Yes, sir. At the back.
Sure. Max Kellett from Portland.
From?
Portland. It strikes me that communication talent and the ability to communicate is inherently important to a lot of the lessons.
Could you hold the microphone a bit closer to your
Apologies, better? So it strikes me that communications and being able to communicate is incredibly important, especially for the lessons you spoke about during your speech. With that in mind, what sort of relationship do you think it's important for a minister to develop with the media and their own social media communities?
So the question is, if you're a minister, what sort of relationship should you develop with the media and with your the social media communities as well? My view is that you have to have a good relationship with the media, but it should not be too close. If you get, in our phrase, into bed with the media, you can find that the media will kill you when you're asleep. And there is, quite correctly in a democracy, an inherent conflict between those in government and those in the media. The government wants to get the best presentation for its policies. The government wants the least attention on its mistakes. The media, first of all, wants to sell newspapers or the equivalent on social media. And one way of selling newspapers or television reports is by reporting things which have not gone well as things which have gone well. And if you get too close to individual reporters or to individual news organizations, because their interests and yours are ultimately opposed, when things go wrong, because things will go wrong for you in government, they will, and you want to hold things back. If you're in the pocket of those reporters, their reaction to you will be much more vicious than if you're standing back a bit. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is, if you ask me about experience in handling social media as a minister, this shows, if you like, how things have changed in the last 6 years. But I finished as a senior minister in 2010. Twitter, I don't think had been invented. Facebook had not been invented. So I literally have had no experience as a minister of having to handle those things. But I would also just say this, that I see younger politicians becoming obsessed about social media. You cannot ignore it because these days, as you know, more and more people are getting their sense of news not from the traditional media, the newspapers or the websites of newspapers and big news organizations, but from Twitter feeds, from what their friends are saying on Facebook and so on. So there's been an atomization of sources of information. So you can't ignore it, but you should also not become obsessed by it. Because otherwise, you could just spend your whole time thinking, do I respond to this, do I respond to that? The most important thing, if you are a minister, is to get on with your job and make decent decisions. Because if you get on with your job and make decent decisions, then you're more likely to survive. And if you like to take a football analogy, if you're a footballer, the most important thing is that you get on the pitch, score goals, stop the other side scoring goals. That's what you're paid for as a minister, and let other people record it. Any other questions, please? Yeah, yes.
Very much for a very, very interesting presentation. But there was something that stayed in my mind since before the attack on Iraq. I remember Tony Blair went to Moscow just before the attack to discuss the issue in Moscow. And in the press conference with actually, at that time was Putin, the prime minister. He was saying that, explaining like always did, that Saddam Hussein can put things together in 45 minutes, atomic when the bomb and exploded. And I remember Putin was sort of laughing, standing there laughing, like making a joke of this. And then when he took the stand to get answer to the question, he said, Mr. Blair, we are involved in Iraq. We know Iraq very well. There is no such a possibility. When the Prime Minister of Russia at that time was saying that, what was the reaction among you guys yourself?
Okay.
Was it?
Well, with respect, sir, one of the interesting things about the aftermath of the Iraq War is how people's memories of what happened on the way to the Iraq War vary very much. As I said earlier, of course there was a big disagreement between Russia, China, Germany, France, and others about whether it was appropriate to take military action against Saddam Hussein. There was, however, no disagreement about whether Saddam Hussein, that regime, posed a threat to international peace and security, because that was the point of the big Security Council resolution 1441, which was passed unanimously by the Security Council, including Syria, by the way, in early November 2002. And that resolution said that Iraq posed a threat to international peace and security by reasons of its long-range missile systems and its proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's there. So Russia had judged at the time that Iraq did have this material. And I never recall Igor Ivanov saying to me, well, they didn't. I mean, that wasn't the issue. And for example, a lot of the intelligence that we had about biological weapons, or as we thought about biological weapons, came from the BND, which was the German intelligence system. So it just emphasizes my point that there was a broad agreement about whether there was a threat. There was disagreement about methods. So I genuinely don't remember President Putin reacting in that way. What we were trying to do was to get an international consensus with an ultimatum to Saddam. And to this day, I do not fully understand why he refused to cooperate properly with the inspectors, given that, in fact, as it turned out, he didn't have anything to hide. There we are. Any further questions, please? Okay. Oh, yes. Can we have the microphone here, please?
Thank you very much for your information. I have a question about English law.
English law?
English law. I'm making a research in English law. As you know, very soon we will open International Financial Center in Astana.
Yes, yeah.
And according to this center, we changed our constitutional law today. And some of your English British politics and judges, they will come to Astana and they will do their job in Astana in Kazakh law, but their job will be based on English law. How do you think? You was talking about lucky politicians.
Yeah.
What they need to do to make success in this job?
Okay. Well, look, I am an English lawyer, and so I know quite a lot about English law, and I was the Justice Minister, so I know quite a lot about our legal system. I pretend to no expertise at all about the basis of Kazakh law. What, however, I'd say is that when you scratch the surface of legal systems and you find that on the surface there are some big differences. But underneath the surface, there are some similarities because whatever the system, the law is trying to deal with the same aspects of human behavior. So to take an obvious example in the area of criminal law, in every legal system in the world, murder is a crime, and every legal system in the world has a system of trial to determine guilt or innocence. There are many systems where that needs to be improved, but that's the case. If you take the issue of contract law, which is what you're thinking about more, business cannot operate at all unless parties to a transaction, whether it's for the sale of commodities, of building a hotel, running a factory, providing labor, unless they can write down the terms and conditions on which they are operating, agree those, and then have a system for enforcing those terms and conditions. And if you haven't got that system, you can't have any kind of trade. So there are, I say, underneath the surface, similarities in fundamental terms between legal systems. The other thing I'd say is that, and I am biased, one of the reasons why English law is used as the proper law of contract across the world in third-party transactions is because the detailed concepts we're using and the judgments that are made about some complicated aspects of law within the English legal system are on the whole very good, and that's why it's used.
And I have a second question. As to a lawyer, how do you think the English doctrines, how they will work in Kazakh law, in Astana? For example, law of equity.
Law of equity, right. Well, again, if you want a well-functioning legal system, you've got to have a law of equity. And essentially, the law of equity is about saying, don't just look at who is the legal owner of property, but look at on whose behalf they are operating. So you need to look at who is the beneficial owner or the beneficiary of all kinds of legal rights. And that's how the law of equity developed, going back to the Middle Ages and particularly the Tudor Stuart periods in England. But so I say I have no expertise on Kazakh law, but if you want Kazakhstan to become a major financial center, importing English legal the English legal concepts and practices is a very good idea. All right, thank you very much. And very last question.
Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. Mr. Stroh, my question is about the UK politics on international recovery of the stolen assets. A few years ago, there was a huge scandal when the BBC Egyptian journalists produced a documentary video where they heavily criticized the UK on lack of interaction in terms of freezing Hosni Mubarak's assets in the UK. So I would like to know if there are any improvements since then.
Okay. I can't comment on I cannot comment on an individual case. So I can't possibly comment about the freezing or otherwise of former President Mubarak's assets. However, we have taken a lot of steps in recent years to improve international cooperation and the freezing of assets. I did that a lot when I was the Interior Minister, and again, sought to do that when I became Justice Minister. And part of this is we've also very strongly tightened up our anti-corruption measures. So one of the very final acts of Parliament for which I was responsible in 2010 was a new Bribery Act. And that's really tough. And it places corporate responsibility on companies in respect of bribery, as well as making the jurisdiction an international one. Okay? Well, this better be the really last question. Okay.
Welcome. It is nice to listen to you. One of the subject was lucky. And what was your best luck that you take place 30 years in political life? And whether that is lucky time for Brexit or that will be beginning of the end, and what you think about this?
Well, the answer in my case is the luckiest thing for me occurred after, in the darkness of a very unlucky period. So my party lost the 1979 election, the 1983 election, the 1987 election, and the 1992 election. By that stage, I'd been in the British Parliament for 13 years, all entirely on the opposition side. I was in my mid-40s in terms of age, and I was very depressed along with my colleagues. And I thought about leaving politics and going back to being a lawyer or doing something else, because I was so depressed about this. And it just seemed that there was just darkness for us. And a friend of mine, very old friend, said, no, you must stay in politics. You never know what's going to happen. And I took his advice. For a year or so, it continued to be horrible, but then the gods were nice to us, and our luck changed. Nothing to do with me, it was just how the British public was seeing the Conservatives. And then Tony Blair became leader, and I was close to Tony Blair, so I did the jobs I did. On Brexit, I'm very strongly in favour of Britain remaining a member of the European Union. And am clear that the European Union has been a noble project. Of course, you can be irritated by the fact that you see it as bureaucratic, because if you're trying to secure cooperation between 28 different countries, it's bound to be a bit complicated. But if you have any sense of history in Europe, you know that in the past, whenever there were big arguments between countries in Europe, those arguments were resolved by people killing each other. And not just in 2 world wars in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, and so on. And we've avoided war on the mainland of Europe as a result of the European Union. The European Union has also been responsible for pretty smoothly bringing the former Eastern European countries into forms of democracy without serious social and political upheavals. If you think about the state of Romania, when Ceausescu was thrown out, it could easily have become a complete basket case, as we say, but it didn't. And that's attributed to the European Union. And there are many other benefits as well. And I am appalled by those who, on the other side, who say, if we leave the European Union, we can essentially have all the benefits of the European Union without having to pay for it. Okay, well, you know, if politicians who go around pulling out their wallet and promising pound notes to people for nothing are not trusted. And I simply do not trust what we're being told. We're being told by senior British politicians, you can leave the European Union and you can still be part of the single market. Well, if you want to be part of the single market, you have to accept free movement of people. You also have to accept that you'll have to pay a contribution to this club. If that's the case, why on earth are you going to leave? But there's all sorts of other nonsense talked about it. But also, what I saw when I was a minister is that if you are a member of the European Union, you do the work, you build up the personal relationships with other people in Europe, you can and usually do ensure that the interests of your country are interests which are then become shared by the rest of the European Union. It's not that difficult. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, thank you.